Bonjour, bonjour, and surprise, I'm coming in a day early. So I was going to share the story tomorrow, but it was all ready to go, and why not share it today? Because it's an event that happened 230 years ago on this day. And I'll tell you at the end about another event that happened even farther back than that one. But one great thing I want to do with the podcast is not only share with you all these fantastic stories of people in French history, but also there's so many great events. And I have literally just an expanding list every single day. I think I add sometimes 2 or 3 things, sometimes 10 things on there, and of events that have happened in Paris that can be depicted in paintings and art in the buildings of Paris, something that's also visual as well as telling you the story. So I have a lot of them, and there's a couple of them that I've wanted to do for a long time, and this includes one of those ladies, Josephine, that was, as we know, most people know her as the wife of Napoleon Bonaparte. But she's been somebody I've really wanted to do for a long time, even on the old podcast. But her story, there's so much there that I think it will take me probably a year of research to do it the way I want to do it. So with some of these kind of stories, I think I'm going to just break it up and give you different events and then a little backstory where it fits in. And then that way, over time, we'll get to talk about all of them. So there's a few of them that includes not only Josephine, but the year 1661 itself being such a monumental one in the life of Louis the 14th. And then another one that I love is the Marie de Medici paintings that were done by Rubens, and he did those 24 paintings that are in the Louvre, and they are really is one of my very favorite rooms in the entire Louvre. But they are going to be restored this year. They say, I think in the summer it's going to start, or in the fall, and it's going to take 5 years. Now, 5 years is what it took to restore Notre Dame. These are 24 paintings, and they're huge, including 3 that are like really big. But so I was kind of hoping when they were doing research on them, I think it was before the Olympics. It was reopened before the Olympics for months. They were doing all the x-rays and all that kind of stuff, which usually means that they're going to restore them. But I was hoping that if they did, they do them one at a time, just take down one. But no, they're not going to do that. And of course, like 24 paintings, this literally costs millions of euros. And so the Amis du Louvre, the Friends of the Louvre, which I am also a part of, they raised a whole bunch of money. They had a whole bunch of people give some very, very big donations. And so that is, you got to do it while you got the money. And the Louvre, as we know, is under all sorts of scrutiny, so you better do it fast. We'll see if this actually happens. But that's another one that I've literally wanted to share for probably 10 years since I first saw them. And so we're going to go through each one of them one by one, because a lot of them are all around certain dates. So that's something that I'm really excited to do, because that is also kind of what I do a lot of times with my Instagram and social media, is things that happen. And, like last week we shared Bert Morisot. It was also the day before, on March 2nd is the day she died, and that came out on March 3rd. But I always have this long list of all these things, and this week there's so many things. And then also we're leading up to Easter, and there's lots of things I want to share about the story of Easter with the resurrection and how that is told in art. And even if you're not religious, because you don't need to be to want to understand more about what's in these paintings. And, you could go into Notre Dame, or you go into any of the churches, and especially into the Louvre, and you could see a painting and say, oh, hey, I know what that story is now. And you don't have to be religious. So it's kind of, there's take the, religious aspect out of it and look at it as a piece of history. So, or if you are very religious and you love the story, it's kind of for everybody, but it kind of gives you just a little bit more to know when you go into a museum or church, and you'll be able to, this whole story unfolds before your eyes, which is what I love. So let's jump in. And so it was on this day, on March 9th, 1796, a lovely lady by the name of Marie-Joseph Rose de Tacher stood in a drawing room of the second floor of the Hôtel de Madrion and watched a taper candle melt to the end of its wick. It was 7 p.m. and the civil wedding of Napoleon Bonaparte and Rose, as she was known at the time, was supposed to start, but things didn't go quite as planned. You might know her more as Josephine, a woman whom Napoleon would love until his very last breath. The Paris of 1795 and 96 was a mix of living under the revolution's rules, those who survived the terror, and figuring out how to forge ahead and survive, especially for a woman. Marie-Joseph Rose was first married to a real cat of a guy, Alexander de Beauharnais. The arranged marriage was originally intended for her sister, Catherine and Beauharnais, but she died in 1777 before she could sail from Martinique to France. Rose and Alexander were married on December 15, 1779, in Noisy-le-Grand, just outside of Paris. Rose, as she was then known, discovered a taste of the high life. Lavish surroundings, fashion, and parties, but it came at a price. Alexander, a lieutenant general of the army, was later arrested and tried for treason and killed by the guillotine on July 23, 1794. Josephine was also arrested due to her husband's actions, but escaped the terror and was released on August 6, 1794, 4 months after her arrest and the fall of Robespierre. As a widow with 2 young children, she didn't have many avenues to provide for herself and her 2 children. A small income came from her husband's pension, but her taste for the good life cost a bit more. Women didn't have many options back then. They couldn't go out and get a job, at least not a respectable one. Josephine had a few men who showered her in gifts and money, including the politician Paul Barras. Their relationship was short-lived when he couldn't afford the lavish spending on Josephine. Active in the Revolution, Barras voted for the death of Louis XVI and served in the Directory while Napoleon rose to power. It's thought that the first meeting between Napoleon and Josephine could have been in this salon held in the home of Teresa Tallien, the belle of the Parisian salons, and often described as the bestie of Josephine. Teresa came from a wealthy Spanish family and was sent to France at 12 years old. Ahead of her time, she wove through society, dodging the guillotine during the terror and creating a salon that drew the movers and shakers of Paris, from Lafayette to Napoleon. It was one of the most influential gatherings in Paris and on what is now the Rue Matignon. Described as very beautiful, Teresa garnered the gaze of every man from Bordeaux to Paris, including Paul Barras, who really got around, with whom she had one of her many affairs and the many in the French elite. It was at one of her legendary salons that Barras would bring Josephine. Napoleon Bonaparte had his eyes on the lovely hostess Teresa, but she wasn't too interested. Did Napoleon meet Rose that night? We don't know for sure. The most likely event also included Barras and Teresa at a dinner party on October 15, 1794, inside the Palais de Luxembourg, where he was living. Barras, ever the politician, knew to keep Napoleon near him and happy. However, the meeting that would make the most impact came a year later. Napoleon was called up by Barras, the commissioner of the French army, to help quell the royalist uprising in Paris. It would end in the legendary whiff of grape shot episode when he launched into the crowd and onto the facade of the Église Saint-Roch on the Rue Saint-Honoré, injuring and killing many, but also ending the uprising against the government. Today, you can still see some of those marks from the grape shot on the facade of the Church of Saint-Roch. The event launched Bonaparte's career and an office on the Place Vendôme. A week after the uprising, all citizens were to abandon any and all weapons. Every home in Paris was searched, including the small home at number 60 Rue de la Victoire, where the widow Beauharnais and her 2 children lived. Eugène was born in 1781 and Hortense was born in 1783 and were left with very little of their father. His property and possessions were seized after his arrest and a few items that were returned at the end of the terror. Eugène was 13 when his father was killed and held tight the sword that once belonged to him and begged the soldiers that he be allowed to keep it. The request was denied, but if he wanted to, he could plead his case to the Department of War at the Place Vendôme. The next day, the young Eugène, although not so young, at 13 you could serve as the king and be married back in those days, had visited number 7 Place Vendôme, now in the shadow of the Vendôme column topped with Napoleon himself. Eugène entered the office of Napoleon and asked for the return of his father's sword. Touched by the request of the young man, Napoleon later wrote, "I granted his request." Eugène burst into tears when he beheld his father's sword. "I was touched at his sensibility." Josephine was so impressed that she paid General Bonaparte a visit the next day to thank him. Napoleon continued writing. Everyone knows her extraordinary grace, her irresistible, sweet, attractive manners. The acquaintance soon became intimate and tender. The early Napoleon was far from the myth that has been created over time. Standing at 5'6", not at all short for that time, quite a normal French height. The long-standing rumor was created by his English enemies and survives until this day. If there's one thing anybody knows, they all say Napoleon was short. I mean, there's even the Napoleonic complex, which I did know one of those. He was quiet, he was rather awkward and shy, and Josephine would serve as his muse, bringing out the inner general and future emperor. The intimate relationship between the two began quickly, as did talk of marriage. Napoleon was about to leave on another campaign, but first he wanted a wife. Josephine wasn't so sold on the idea, but she did need to be taken care of. Paying another visit to Place Vendôme, this time to her notaire, Jean Ragadeau, looking for advice on whether she should get married. He advised her that the young general had little to offer and was against it. She decided not to listen to him and married Napoleon anyway on March 9, 1796, 230 years ago today. The mairie of the 2nd arrondissement was once located in the Hôtel Mondragon, built in 1723. The beautiful building once covered the entire block and was built for Pierre-Étienne Bourgeois de Bouillon, Secretary of the Navy under Louis XV. It was sold in 1776 to Louis Duval de L'Epinois, Secretary to Louis XV, and remained in his family after his death until the start of the Revolution. One of the hundreds of confiscated properties in Paris, it became the mayor's office for the 2nd arrondissement in 1795, and it was on the historic day that aligned Bonaparte and Marie-Joseph Rose de Techer. Napoleon preferred to call her Josephine, and how she is known and remembered throughout history. For 3 hours, Josephine waited in a long white gown with a blue, white, and red sash and wearing a gold enameled medallion or a ring. History is a little up in the air on that was engraved with Au Destin inscribed. There's also some information about a ring that was attributed to the wedding with NB engraved on it. It was later given by Napoleon to Hortense, Josephine's daughter, and then passed to her son, who would end up being Napoleon III. It was buried with him after his death on January 9, 1873, in the Farnborough Abbey of Kent, England. Josephine recalls watching the single taper candle burn down to nothing as they waited for Napoleon to arrive. He finally arrived after 10 p.m. and said, "Marry us quickly." The official had already given up waiting and left, and his fill-in may not have had the right to actually perform the service. It's thought and told by some that he was late because he was having 2 fake birth certificates made. Josephine was older. She was 32 at the time. Back then, that's pretty old. Born on June 23, 1763, and Napoleon was 26, born on August 15, 1769. Napoleon's birth date was changed to February 5, 1768, which also changed his place of birth from Corsica to the Republic of Genoa. Exactly 1 year before Napoleon was born, on August 15, 1768, Louis XV brought Corsica under the French flag. Josephine's birthday was changed to August 15, 1769, the date of actual Napoleon's birth. Not exactly the best and brightest altering official documents, but maybe that's why today, if you live here, you have to go through having your birth certificate translated into French what feels like every other day. The Bonaparte family was unaware of the nuptials, but would never have approved it if they had been. Only a few people watched the ceremony, including the former lover Josephine, Paul Barras, Jean Lambert Tallien, and his wife Teresa, who we'll just call the unofficial maid of honor, and Etienne Jacques Jérôme Calmet, a family friend of Josephine. During the Revolution, religious ceremonies had been outlawed. A civil ceremony made it much easier to get a divorce, which Josephine wanted, but would also use to her advantage 8 years later on the eve of the coronation. Once married, the couple lived in Josephine's home at 60 Rue de la Victoire. The honeymoon would have to wait as Napoleon was off to Italy to lead the army 2 days after the wedding. Fast forward 8 years to November 25th, 1804, when the Pope arrived at the Chateau de Fontainebleau, as Napoleon didn't want him to make a grand entrance into Paris. Having the Pope there was nothing more than a staged moment for the would-be new emperor, linking his coronation to that of Charlemagne, the first Holy Roman Emperor, named by Pope Leo III on Christmas Day in the year 800. As for that whole grabbing the crown story, that's not exactly accurate either, and it's also tied to Charlemagne and the Pope, but that's for another day. When the Pope roamed the halls of Fontainebleau, Josephine confided in him that the imperial couple had never been married in the church. The Pope was not happy. Since the two were not wed in the eyes of the church, he could not attend or perform the coronation. Napoleon was less than thrilled and agreed in the 11th hour on the eve of the coronation to be married. On December 1st, 1804, the night before the big event, in the chapel of the Palais des Tuileries, Napoleon's uncle, the Cardinal Joseph Fache, performed the quick ceremony to the dismay of the Bonapartes. The official love story of Josephine and Napoleon ended with the annulment of their marriage on December 15, 1809, in the throne room of the Tuileries, steps from where the Russian Catholic ceremony had taken place just 5 years earlier. Unable to give Napoleon an heir to the imperial throne, Josephine was cast out of the palace and his life, but never far from his mind. His final word on his deathbed was Josephine. Now, a few years ago, the big blockbuster movie came out, done by Ridley Scott, called Napoleon, had Joaquin Phoenix in it. And I saw it when it came out. And then I watched this weekend. I had it on in the background while I was putting my notes together, because the extended cut on Apple TV is supposed to have more about Josephine. Now, when I saw this in the theater, I have a very hard time with historical things, because as soon as I see that they took liberties or they changed things or they didn't follow the actual history, it really bothers me. I can't read historical fiction. So all the time when people say you should read this book, and as soon as I know, I say, is it historical fiction? Because I can't read it. I just can't. But I saw this movie in the theater because I was so excited that finally they were doing a story about French history in a big epic movie. It's always about, British history. And I saw it here in Paris. And the first scene showed Napoleon at the beheading of Marie Antoinette, which was not true. And it just kind of goes downhill from there. Now, when this movie came out, pretty much for about 2 or 3 months, everywhere you went, there was at dinners, at lunches with a lot of French people. And oh boy, they had thoughts on this. They were very upset about it. And just, and I would say, well, this also isn't made for the French. This is made for an American audience. This is, but I'd also say that you can't put the life of Napoleon, which there's all sorts of crazy twists and turns. You can't put that in a 2-hour and 20-minute movie. You obviously can't do it in an over 3-hour movie because the extended cut is really long. And they still took some liberties. So, but I did watch it again this weekend, and I should say I forced myself to finish it because, oh boy, the fact that they, put dates on the screen that weren't even accurate or in the right order. They tell the story of the returning of the sword, but he goes to her apartment to return it. And then they show later the uprising, which it's like they didn't even keep things in the correct order. I was impressed, though, that the coronation, which was the part I was the most excited about seeing when I originally saw it in the theater, is, they did a really good job of what the altar looked like, of what the candlesticks at Notre Dame that still survive look like, what his crown looked like. That's probably the only thing I could say good about that movie. If you've seen it, but it's I watched it twice. The Vanessa Kirby plays Josephine, and she also played Princess Margaret in The Crown, which she was amazing, and she was amazing in this. What they did also do is they did a good depiction of how awkward and kind of strange Napoleon was, because you see that with Joaquin Phoenix. I think they actually did a pretty good job of that, because I think that a lot of times people think of Napoleon like, okay, oh, the short little guy, but he was, he was actually a really good tactician. He was really good at, when he went into battle and what he did, at first. But they did that part good. They did, but he was pretty awkward and kind of, dorky is a better word to say. But it's on Apple TV. If you have Apple TV and you want to give away 4 hours of your life, go ahead. I do highly recommend, if you want to see a better one, watch Napoleon and Epic Life. It has Isabella Rossellini as Josephine and Christian Clavier as Napoleon, and it's a multiple part mini-series, and it's really great. And they actually used the real places, like they actually used Malmaison. They didn't even do that in the Joaquin Phoenix movie. They did, like, it's also like, at least use a picture of the outside of Malmaison. Like, they didn't even it just was, that's how I felt about it. But if you can see Napoleon and Epic Life, it is really, really great. I'm not sure if it's on any streaming services right now, but keep an eye out for it. If you do, I think it's probably the best one I've seen about Napoleon. It was really great. But one more little thing, there was another thing that actually happened on this date 365 years ago. As I was saying earlier, 1661 was a pivotal moment and year in the life of Louis XIV. After the death of his closest advisor and godfather, Cardinal Mazarin, he was able to seize control of the government, and the grand story of the Sun King began when he was just 22 years old. A few weeks ago, I shared the story of the fire of the Petite Gallery, which is now what we call the Apollo Gallery. But Cardinal Mazarin, he influenced everything from the people who had access to the king to the design of the royal buildings and the amassing of the royal collection. In the 1650s, with the architect Louis Laveau, Mazarin sought to expand the Palais du Louvre to include a theater, library, and galleries for the king's paintings, sculptures, and other objects. But it was in the early morning hours of February 6, 1661, that Cardinal Mazarin was awakened by his guards as his chamber filled with smoke from the fire quickly spreading through the Petite Gallery. The cardinal had become very weak and sick over the past months and was carried down the steps of the Escalier Henri II in a chair by his guards. He was quickly taken to his palace a few blocks away, the Palais Mazarin, which is now the Bibliothèque Nationale, and he was deeply shaken by the fire and would die a month later on today's date, March 9th in 1661. So he was a pretty pivotal, very pivotal he was a very pivotal and influential man over Louis XIV, and the blow would be heavy for him. But on the next day, on March 10th, 1661, is when Louis XIV took the power. Now, if you were coming to Paris and you want to plan out your time for next year, I wanted to also advise you on something that I noticed, especially this morning, walking across the city this morning to an appointment, that one thing you really want to do is check the school vacation calendars. And so right now, today was the first day back to school for kids in the C region, which includes Paris. And so I was walking past the Louvre this morning and I was like, oh my gosh, it's 8:30 and there's like 12 people in line. And that is because we are in between in a very, very sweet spot of no vacations. So you want to look online and you could search, Paris or French school calendar, holiday calendars 2027 or 2026. And there's going to be three regions. There's the A, B, and C region. C is, of course, Paris, but A and B means, and a lot of times, except for in the summer, and I think Christmas is the only time they're all at the same time. But in these other weeks, like they went back to school a week ago. So this last week was just the French or the Paris kids that were in Paris and surrounding region. They were on vacation. And so what that means is that when it's the A and B regions, Paris gets really busy because those people come, those families come up from the countryside to Paris to visit at some point during that, a lot of times. And then, but the other thing is that when it's the C group on vacation, it means they leave Paris. And today I just was like, oh my gosh, because we're also a couple weeks before the spring break in the States. So this week is going to be a very sweet, wonderful week of it being much quieter. It's also the end of Fashion Week. Fashion Weekend's tomorrow. That doesn't really affect, I've had people ask me if they, what, is it going to be too busy? And it's not. It just affects where there's a show. It's not going to really affect, and going to City Pharma. I say, do not go to City Pharma during Fashion Week. But if you're coming, take a look at that. I know a lot of people, before I lived here, I'd always come in the spring and then in the fall because you were thinking you'd miss the busy times. But that's not always the case because you also have to look at the kind of the European vacation and when that goes. But, maybe make a note for next year at this time. This is a good sweet spot. But also you probably want to check on when Easter is, because if Easter's early, that could also change the vacation as well. So, it's all just up in the air. So anyway, but that's, today it's sunny and beautiful, and I think we're supposed to get rain tomorrow, but we'll enjoy it while we have it. So thank you guys so much for joining me today, a day earlier than normal. And I am going to go out, and hopefully if there's not a lot of rain this week, and go make a little video of all these places that I talked about today. And I'll post that on my YouTube as well. So make sure to check that out, and you can find more information at ClaudineHemingway.com. And if you want to book a walking a walking tour, why not book a tour? And we will walk through Paris, and I'll tell you all about Josephine and Napoleon, and we'll walk by all these great places as well. So again, find it at ClaudineHemingway.com, and have a wonderful day.